Good morning, AP class. I wanted to talk to you today about the New Deal. Actually, I'm going to do a series of videos about this. Interestingly enough, I'm not going to talk about any of the New Deal programs in this one. I'm going to talk about the philosophical underpinnings, which means I'm going to talk about a grumpy Brit by the name of John M Keynes, this fella behind me. So Keynes is an economist. He is really the economist of the 20th century. He's the guy that sort of figures out how the 20th century economy works with these big industrial economies and, you know, the whole world, all that. So he looks specifically at recessions and depressions and how governments should react to those. So traditional wisdom had been that governments should practice austerity. Austerity is basically governments cut back on everything during hard times, spend less money, all that, so that they collect less taxes and improve things. Reality, though, was we'd been having a half century of cyclical depressions, and this hadn't ever actually worked. So Keynes looks at things and comes up with some theorems, some ideas about how a government should respond to a major recession or depression. And this is what he came up with. One of the things that makes recessions or depressions worse and unemployment during those worse is excessive savings, both by people and by companies. Basically, if nobody's spending money, if everybody's too afraid to spend money, then the economy doesn't do very well. That kind of makes sense in a modern consumer economy. If everybody's cutting back at the same time, that tends to make a depression worse and cause businesses to lay off more people. It's not rocket science if you think of it, but this was sort of radical for its time. You're seeing some of that during this coronavirus mess going on. It's why, well, I'll get to that later. Austerity during severe recessions makes it worse, not better. Again, if the government, along with people, are spending less money, then things are going to cycle downward. All right, straightforward this point. Now we get to the really controversial parts. So, he said that budget deficits by government during periods of difficulty are a good thing. This has sort of been bastardized in the modern era to imply that governments can spend money as they will and not worry about how taxes are being collected. That is actually a disastrous viewpoint. The point Keynes was making is that when you're going through an emergency, like a depression, you're going to come out ahead if you borrow a little money and soften it now, early on, so that it doesn't cycle out of control. And if that means for a couple of years you run a budget deficit, fine, because you're going to make up the difference of that in taxes once you're out of it. That's the general theory behind the thing. And it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Up to this point, guys like Hoover had been so anti-deficit, which it sounds odd given that I'm an anti-deficit guy, but that they couldn't see the reality of the situation. Keynes is like the anti-Hoover. So that's a really important point in that it was okay for governments to go into debt, borrow money during these hard times to make the hard times less damaging to the economy, and that would mean that you were better off on the outcome. If you look at a modern example, the 2008 recession, the U.S. government between the Bush and Obama administrations spent buckets of money, borrowed buckets of money to soften that blow. It could have been infinitely worse than it was. Now, what we didn't do was once we were sort of out of that, start collecting taxes again to rebuild, government finances and pay off those debts. That's an issue we've had. Now that we're going into another emergency, we're trying to do economic stimulus, but we haven't recovered from the last one. That's sort of a problem. The Keynesian model really says that you have to borrow money only during emergencies and bad times, and then you have to pay that money off during the good times in between. And that is a key part of this. We've been really good at the first part and not so good at the second part in the modern age. That was different during the Great Depression, World War II era. After the war, we paid off debts at a pretty rapid rate through the 1940s and 50s, partially because we were making so much money on rebuilding the world. But that's the piece that we've struggled with in the modern age. Nobody likes taxes in America, and unfortunately, during the good time, taxes are supposed to go up for this model. Anyway, we got that. Above all, his theory is that the government must act during bad times to stabilize recessions. Can't get around that. Hoover's government almost totally refused to act. Keynesian economics is the opposite. The government has to act during bad times to prevent these recessions from going too far, really to prevent them from becoming massive depressions like the Great Depression. If you look at the cycles that hit the U.S. in the last chapter, you can sort of see what he's talking about. And this became central to Roosevelt's idea of the New Deal. Roosevelt wanted to act. Roosevelt was fine with borrowing money. Roosevelt put in dozens and dozens of programs that cost billions of dollars in order to try and soften the Great Depression. Unfortunately, he didn't get to it early enough because, again, he wasn't elected until partway through, that he could prevent a depression, but it did soften the blow and set the stage for recovery. Other countries chose to use austerity. It did not work as well. And remember, austerity is just cutting back. All right, so this is the first video. We're going to have several of these. I wanted to hit this because Keynesian economics sounds a little bit scary. In reality, it's pretty straightforward. It's more or less still how governments operate today. All right, be well, stay safe, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.